The hotel lobby was quieter than usual that Tuesday morning. A soft gray light came through the tall windows, and the smell of fresh linen and floor polish hung in the air. The Grand Meridian Hotel in downtown Chicago had a reputation for elegance, and every corner of it was kept to a standard that left guests feeling like they were somewhere important. The staff moved carefully through the space, trained to be present without being noticed, efficient without being loud. It was the kind of place where people with money came to feel comfortable, and where the people who served them learned quickly to stay invisible. Maria Vasquez had worked at the Grand Meridian for 11 years. She was 43 years old, a small woman with dark hair pulled back tight and hands that were always moving. She started her shift at 6 in the morning and finished in the early afternoon. And in those hours she cleaned rooms, changed linens, wiped down surfaces, and made sure that every space she touched looked like no one had ever lived in it. She was good at her job. She was one of the best, and her supervisor knew it, even if the guests rarely thought about her at all. On that particular morning, Maria had been assigned to the banquet wing. There was a large function scheduled for the evening, a corporate dinner for a technology company, and the main hall needed to be cleaned and set before the afternoon crew came in to arrange the tables. Maria arrived with her cart, her mop, her cleaning cloths, and began working through the space methodically. She had done this 100 times. She moved from one end of the hall to the other, and then she saw it. In the far corner of the banquet hall, near the tall arched windows that looked out onto the street, stood a grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway with a polished black surface that caught the light and held it. It had been moved in the night before for the evening's entertainment, and it sat there quietly like something waiting. Maria slowed when she passed it. She looked at it for a moment. Then, almost without thinking, she set down her cloth and walked toward it. She had not played in years. That part of her life had been put away, folded up and stored in some place she rarely visited, the way you might store something precious that no longer fits into the life you are living. But the sight of the piano did something to her that she could not quite explain. It pulled at her in a way that felt older than memory. She reached out and touched the keys, not pressing them, just resting her fingers there for a moment. The ivory was cool and smooth. She did not notice the man standing in the doorway. His name was Richard Calloway, and he was the regional vice president of the company hosting that evening's event. He was 51, trim, well-dressed, the kind of man who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never really been told no. He had come to the hall early to check on the setup, and he had stopped in the doorway when he saw the cleaning woman standing at the piano. He watched her for a moment, and then something in him shifted from mild curiosity to something less generous. He stepped into the room and spoke loudly enough to make sure she heard him. He told her that the piano was not something for the staff to touch. He said it plainly and without warmth, the way someone might correct a child who had wandered into the wrong room. He said the instrument had been brought in specifically for a professional performer and that it was not appropriate for housekeeping to be handling it. He used the word handling, as though what she had done was careless or clumsy or presumptuous. He looked at her the way some people look at others when they have already decided who they are. Maria did not respond immediately. She looked at him calmly. There was no anger on her face, or if there was, it was buried beneath something steadier and older. She apologized quietly and took a small step back from the piano. She picked up her cloth from where she had set it down. She was going to walk away. That had always been the easier thing to do. 11 years in that hotel had taught her how to absorb moments like this one and keep moving, because the work still needed to be done and the morning was not finished. But then something changed in her. It was not defiance exactly. It was more like a door opening that she had kept shut for a long time. She looked at the piano once more. She looked at the man in the doorway who had already turned slightly away, satisfied that the matter was resolved. And she made a decision so quiet and so small that it barely felt like a decision at all. She sat down at the bench. She placed both hands on the keys. She did not rush. She did not look at him. She simply closed her eyes for one brief moment, the way a person does before stepping into something they have not done in a long time but have never forgotten how to do. And then she began to play. The first notes rose up into the stillness of that large empty room, clear and steady and full, and the sound of them changed everything about the air in that space. Richard Calloway stopped moving. He turned back. His expression, which had been settled and certain just a moment before, shifted into something he did not have a word for yet. Began the way music sometimes does, quietly at first, and then all at once filling every corner of the space it enters. The notes Maria played were not random. They were not the hesitant sounds of someone testing an instrument they barely knew. What came from that piano was structured and confident and deeply felt, the kind of playing that tells you immediately that the person at the keys has spent thousands of hours there. She moved through the opening phrases of a Chopin nocturne, one she had learned as a young girl in Guadalajara. one that her teacher had made her practice until her fingers knew it better than her mind did. The music came back to her not as something she was remembering, but as something that had simply been waiting inside her, patient and intact. Richard Calloway had not moved from where he stood. His hand was still resting lightly on the back of a chair near the doorway, the way it had landed when he turned around, and he had not thought to move it. He was watching her, but more than that, he was listening, and listening in the way that good music forces you to listen, not as a choice, but as an involuntary surrender to something larger than the moment you were standing in. His plan had been to do a quick walkthrough of the hall, make a few notes on his phone, speak to the event's coordinator, and then get upstairs to his room before his 9 o'clock call. None of that was happening now. A young hotel employee named Daniel had been carrying a stack of folded tablecloths through the corridor outside the banquet hall when the sound reached him. He stopped walking. He set the tablecloths down on a nearby cart and leaned slightly toward the open doorway. He had worked at the Grand Meridian for only 8 months, and he had seen Maria around the hotel many times, exchanged a few words with her in the break room, thought of her the way you think of anyone you work alongside without really knowing. He had no idea what he was hearing was coming from her. He stepped closer to the doorway and looked in, and when he saw that it was Maria at the piano, he stood very still, as though moving might break something. Within a few minutes, there were others. A woman from the front desk had stepped away from her station to bring a message to the banquet coordinator and had heard the music drifting through the corridor. She stopped just outside the hall and listened. A man who was part of the catering company, arriving early to begin unloading supplies, had set down his dolly near the service entrance and followed the sound without quite realizing he was doing it. These people did not know each other well, and under ordinary circumstances, they would have each gone about their separate tasks without much interaction. But music does something to people that almost nothing else can. It gathers them without asking. Maria was aware that she was no longer alone in the room, but she did not stop. She had made her decision when she sat down, and it was a complete one. She was not playing to prove something, or at least that was not the whole of it. She was playing because the music had asked her to, and because she had said no to that request for too many years. And on this particular morning, in this particular room, she did not have it in her to say no again. The nocturne moved through its middle section, which was more intense and searching than the opening, and her right hand carried the melody while her left hand built the architecture beneath it, steady and full. And her body moved slightly with the phrases the way a person does when the music is not separate from them but is coming through them. Richard Calloway had pulled out his phone at some point in the first minute, almost out of habit, and then put it back in his pocket without unlocking it. He was not thinking about his 9 o'clock call. He was not thinking about the setup checklist, or the seating arrangement for the dinner, or any of the dozen things that had occupied his mind when he walked into that hall 15 minutes ago. He was thinking about his mother, which surprised him. His mother had played piano. Not professionally, not even particularly well by any technical standard, but she had played in the living room of their house in Michigan on Sunday afternoons when he was a boy. And something in what Maria was playing had reached back through 30 years and found that memory and brought it forward into the room with him. He felt something shift in his chest that he was not prepared for. The nocturne was approaching its final section now, the part that returns to the quietness of the opening but carries within it everything that has happened in between, so that the simplicity at the end feels earned rather than easy. Maria brought it home slowly, letting each phrase breathe, not rushing toward the finish. The last few notes fell into the silence of the room one at a time, and when they were gone, the silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had existed before she began. It was the silence that music leaves behind, which is fuller and more present than ordinary quiet. No one in the doorway moved or spoke for a long moment. Daniel, the young employee with the tablecloths, was the first to make a sound. It was not a word. It was the kind of exhale a person lets out when they have been holding their breath without knowing it. The woman from the front desk pressed her hand briefly to her mouth. The catering man shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in the particular way people shake their heads when something has exceeded what they expected from the world. Richard Calloway finally moved. He straightened. He looked at Maria, who had lifted her hands from the keys and let them rest in her lap, and he looked at her differently than he had looked at her before. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been, and the authority that had been in it earlier had been replaced by something more uncertain and more honest. He asked her where she had learned to play like that. 5:12 p.m. Maria did not answer right away. She sat at the bench for a moment with her hands still in her lap, looking at the keys rather than at the man who had asked the question. It was not that she was ignoring him. It was more that the question had reached into a part of her life that she did not often bring out into the open. And she needed a second to decide how much of it she wanted to share with a stranger who, just minutes ago, had spoken to her as though she did not belong near the instrument she had just played. She turned on the bench and looked at him. Her expression was not unkind, but it was measured. She had spent enough years reading people in hotel corridors and banquet halls to know when someone was genuinely asking and when someone was asking out of politeness or surprise. What she saw in Richard Calloway's face at that moment was something she had not expected. The confidence that had been so prominent in him when he walked into the room had softened considerably. He was looking at her the way people look when they realize they have misread a situation badly and are not yet sure what to do with that realization. She told him she had studied in Mexico. She said it simply, without decoration. She had grown up in Guadalajara, the second of 4 children, in a house where money was not plentiful, but where her father believed firmly that his children should have something that could not be taken from them. He had decided that something would be music. He worked extra shifts at the factory where he was employed and used what he saved to pay for lessons for Maria, who was 7 years old when she first sat at a teacher's piano and 8 years old when it became clear to everyone in the room that she had a gift that went beyond what lessons alone could explain. Her teacher was a woman named Esperanza Ruiz, who had studied at a conservatory in Mexico City before returning to Guadalajara to teach. She was strict in the way that good teachers often are, demanding in her standards but generous with her time when she saw a student who truly wanted to learn. She recognized in Maria something she had only encountered a few times in her career, a natural musicality that combined technical aptitude with emotional depth, the ability not just to play the notes correctly but to understand what the notes were for. She told Maria's father after the first year that his daughter was exceptional. She said it quietly and carefully, the way you say something that carries weight, because she did not want to put pressure on a child, but she also believed that the truth deserved to be spoken. Maria studied with Esperanza for 9 years. She practiced every day, sometimes for several hours, in the small room at the back of the house where her father had managed to acquire a second-hand upright piano that was slightly out of tune but serviceable. She learned Chopin and Mozart and Beethoven, and composers whose names the people in her neighborhood did not recognize, but whose music she came to love the way you love something that has helped you understand yourself. She competed in regional competitions and placed well. She was accepted at 17 to a music program at a university in Mexico City, and for a brief period of time, the future that Esperanza had seen for her seemed like it might actually take the shape everyone had imagined. But life does not always follow the shape that talent suggests. Maria's father became ill during her first year at university. It was serious, the kind of illness that reorganizes everything around it. Her mother could not manage the household and the medical costs and the care of the younger children alone. Maria came home. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she would go back after things stabilized. She sat with that belief for 2 years while she worked whatever jobs she could find and helped hold her family together. And by the time her father recovered enough that her leaving again became a possibility, something in the momentum of that earlier life had shifted, and she could not find her way back to it. She met her husband in Guadalajara. They married young. They had 2 children. When her husband found work in Chicago through a cousin who had connections there, they made the decision to go, the way many families make such decisions, not with complete confidence but with enough hope to justify the risk. In Chicago, Maria found work at the Grand Meridian. The pay was steady. The management was decent. She learned the job quickly and she was reliable, and the years accumulated the way years do when you are focused on practical things, and the distance between who you are and who you might have been becomes something you stop measuring. She had not played seriously in over 15 years. There had been no piano in any of the apartments they rented. Her children had grown up without hearing their mother play, which was something she thought about occasionally but did not dwell on because dwelling on it did not change it. Richard Calloway listened to all of this. She did not tell it to him in a single long speech. It came out in pieces, some parts briefer than others, and he asked a question here and there, careful ones, the kind that showed he was listening rather than waiting to talk. The people in the doorway had not left. Daniel was still there, and the woman from the front desk, and the catering man, and at some point a second hotel employee had joined them without anyone noticing exactly when. They were all quiet, listening not just to what Maria was saying but to the way she was saying it, which was without self-pity and without bitterness, in a tone that was simply honest about the way a life can turn. When she finished, the room was quiet again. Richard Calloway looked at the floor for a moment and then looked back at her. His jaw was tight in the way that sometimes happens when a person is processing something that has affected them more than they expected. He thought about what he had said to her when he first walked in. He thought about the word he had used and the tone he had used it in, and the assumption he had made in the space of a single glance that had turned out to be so completely and utterly wrong. He said he owed her an apology. He said it directly without softening it into something smaller than it was. 5:15 p.m. Maria looked at him for a moment when he said it. She had received apologies before, in various forms and from various people. And she had learned over the years to tell the difference between the ones that were offered to make the other person feel better and the ones that came from somewhere genuine. What she heard in Richard Calloway's voice was something she had not anticipated from him when the morning began. It did not erase what had happened, and she was not the kind of woman who pretended otherwise, but it was real, and she respected that. She nodded and told him she appreciated it. She said it without coldness and without excessive warmth, in the measured way of someone who accepts what is offered and does not make more of it than it is. Then she stood from the bench, smoothed the front of her uniform, and reached for the cleaning cloth she had set aside. There was still work to be done in the hall, and the morning was not finished, and Maria had never been the kind of person who let a moment, however significant, pull her entirely away from her responsibilities. But Richard Calloway was not finished. He watched her pick up the cloth, and he stood there with something working itself out behind his eyes. He was a man who made decisions for a living. He assessed situations and identified what was missing and figured out how to respond to gaps when he found them. It was the skill that had moved him up through every organization he had ever worked for, and it was operating in him now in a way that had nothing to do with business. He asked her if she had ever thought about playing again. Not as a hobby, not in the vague way people sometimes express wishes they have no real intention of pursuing, but seriously. He asked it as a direct question and waited for a direct answer. Maria paused with the cloth in her hand. The question landed differently than she expected. People had told her over the years that it was a shame she had stopped, her husband sometimes, an old friend from Guadalajara who still played in a small ensemble there. But no one had ever asked her in quite this way, as though playing again were not a distant and slightly melancholy idea, but an actual present possibility that deserved a real answer. She told him honestly that she did not know. She said that the life she had built did not leave much room for the kind of commitment that serious playing required. She said it without apology, but with the particular weight of someone who has thought about a thing many times and arrived at the same practical conclusion each time. She had 2 children, a household, a job that started at 6 in the morning. The piano had been one life and this was another, and she had made her peace with that distinction or something close to peace. Richard told her he understood practical constraints. He said he was not dismissing what she had described. But he told her that what he had heard her play that morning was not something that belonged in the background of a person's life, and that he had been in enough rooms with enough people to know the difference between competence and something rarer than that. He said it plainly, not as flattery but as an observation, and the distinction was clear in the way he said it. Daniel, still standing near the doorway, shifted slightly. He had been listening to the conversation with the particular attention of someone young enough to find the unfolding of other people's lives genuinely instructive. He was 24. And had come to Chicago from Tennessee with a vague plan that had not yet clarified itself into anything specific. He worked at the hotel while he figured out what came next, and most days the job was simply a job. But this morning had become something else, and he was not entirely sure what to do with what he was feeling, which was a complicated mixture of inspiration and something that felt uncomfortably like a question about his own life that he had not been planning to ask himself before noon. The woman from the front desk, whose name was Patricia, had worked at the Grand Meridian for 6 years and had known Maria in the way that coworkers know each other when they share a building but not a schedule. A nod in the corridor, a few words near the coffee machine, the basic geography of familiarity without depth. What she knew about Maria after this morning was more than she had learned in 6 years, and she stood in the doorway feeling something she could not quite name, which was related to how little we sometimes know about the people we see every day and how much of a person can remain invisible when the context they exist in does not give it room to appear. Richard Calloway took out his phone, not to check messages or answer calls, but to open his contacts. He told Maria that he sat on the advisory board of a foundation in Chicago that supported working musicians and artists, people who had training and talent, but whose circumstances had interrupted the path that talent was supposed to lead them down. He said the foundation ran programs, some of them practical financial assistance, access to instruments and rehearsal space, connections to performance opportunities at the community level. He said he wanted to pass her name along if she was open to it. Maria looked at him with an expression that was careful and honest at the same time. She did not immediately say yes. She asked him what that would involve and what would be expected, and whether it was the kind of thing that was realistic for someone in her situation. She asked the questions of a woman who had been disappointed before by things that sounded generous and turned out to be more complicated than they first appeared, not out of cynicism, but out of the specific wisdom that comes from having navigated a life where resources were limited and promises did not always hold their shape. He answered each question directly. He did not oversell it. He told her what the foundation actually offered and where its limitations were and what the process looked like from the beginning. He spoke to her the way he would have spoken to anyone he was giving accurate information to, without the subtle condescension that had been present in his voice an hour earlier. And the difference was not lost on Maria, who noticed such things even when she did not comment on them. By the time he finished explaining, the catering man had quietly returned to his work near the service entrance, and Patricia had remembered that she had left the front desk unattended and slipped back down the corridor. But Daniel had not moved. He was still near the doorway, and when Richard glanced at him, he looked slightly embarrassed to have been caught listening for so long, but he did not leave. Maria was quiet for a moment. Outside the tall windows, the city was fully awake now, the gray light of early morning replaced by something brighter and more direct. She looked at the piano once more, at the polished black surface, and the keys that had held her hands just a short while ago and given back something she had almost convinced herself she no longer needed. She told Richard Calloway that she was open to hearing more. She said it quietly but without hesitation, and in the saying of it something in her posture changed in a way that was subtle but visible to anyone paying attention, a slight lifting, as though a decision had shifted something in the architecture of how she was holding herself. Richard typed her name into his phone and asked for the best way to reach her, and she told him, and he wrote it down with the careful attention of someone who intends to follow through. The corporate dinner that evening went ahead as planned. The banquet hall filled with well-dressed people and the sound of conversation and the gentle percussion of glassware. And a professional pianist played background music during the meal, pleasant and polished and entirely forgettable in the way that background music is designed to be. Richard Calloway sat at the head table and smiled at the right moments and said the right things. And if his mind drifted once or twice during the evening back to the morning and what had happened in that hall before any of the guests arrived, no one around him would have noticed. Maria had finished her shift and gone home by the time the dinner began. She took the train the way she always did, with her bag in her lap and her feet tired in the particular way they got tired after a long shift on hard floors. Her husband was in the kitchen when she arrived, and her younger daughter was at the table doing homework, and the apartment smelled like the soup he had started in the slow cooker that morning. It was ordinary in every way that mattered, the kind of ordinary that is actually the texture of a life when you look at it honestly, and Maria moved through it with the ease of long familiarity. But something was different inside her, and she knew it even if she could not have described it precisely to anyone who asked. It was not excitement exactly, or not only that. It was more like the feeling of having rediscovered a room in a house you have lived in for years, a room you had locked and stopped thinking about, and finding when you finally opened the door again that everything inside it was still intact. Nothing had spoiled, nothing had been lost. It had simply been waiting in the dark for the door to open again. She did not tell her husband everything that night. She mentioned that something interesting had happened at work, that she had played a piano that had been brought in for an event, that one of the guests had heard her and they had spoken afterward. She kept it brief not because she wanted to hide it, but because she was still holding it carefully, the way you hold something fragile while you figure out where to put it. Her husband looked at her with the particular attention of a man who has been married long enough to know when his wife is carrying something significant beneath ordinary words, and he asked her if she was all right. She told him she was better than all right. He nodded and handed her a bowl of soup and did not push further, which was one of the reasons she had always trusted him. Richard Calloway sent an email 3 days later. It was professionally written and specific, as she had come to expect from him based on the brief time she had spent in his company. He included the name of the Foundation's program coordinator, a woman named Susan Tate, and he said he had already spoken to Susan and mentioned Maria's name, and that Susan was expecting to hear from her if she chose to reach out. He had not assumed she would. He had left the door open and told her clearly where it was, and what she did with that information was entirely her own. Maria read the email twice at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning before her shift. Then she read it a third time. She sat with it for 2 days, not because she was uncertain in any deep way, but because she had learned over the years to let important decisions settle before she acted on them, to make sure that what felt right in the first moment still felt right when the newness had worn off. On Friday morning, she wrote a reply to Susan Tate. It was brief and polite and real, and she said she was interested in learning more and asked when they might be able to speak. Susan called her the following week. The conversation lasted 40 minutes and covered the practical details that Maria had asked Richard about in the banquet hall, the financial assistance structure, the access to rehearsal space, the modest performance opportunities the foundation facilitated for participants. Susan was warm without being effusive and informative without being overwhelming. And by the end of the call, Maria had a clear picture of what the path forward might look like and found that it fit, with some adjustment and some coordination, into the life she was already living. She told her husband everything that weekend. She sat across from him at the kitchen table with her coffee and laid it out from the beginning: the piano in the banquet hall, the man in the doorway, the apology, the conversation, the email, the phone call. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he had always known this part of her had not gone anywhere. He said it without drama, the way he said most things, as a simple observation of something he considered to be a fact. He asked what she needed from him to make it work. That question, so direct and so without condition, undid her slightly in the way that kindness from someone you love sometimes does. She told him she would figure out the details and let him know. He said all right and refilled her coffee. She contacted the foundation formally in the third week of the month. She was matched with a rehearsal space 2 evenings a week, a studio in a community arts building not far from their apartment. The foundation also connected her with an upright piano that a retiring music teacher was donating, which was moved into the back room of their apartment on a Saturday morning with the help of her husband and a neighbor and a great deal of maneuvering through a narrow doorway. Her younger daughter stood in the hallway watching and asked if her mother was going to teach her to play. Maria said she would when the time was right. The first evening she sat alone in the rehearsal studio, she did not play immediately. She sat at the bench in the quiet room with her hands in her lap and looked at the keys for a long moment. She thought about her father working extra shifts in Guadalajara so that a 7-year-old girl could sit at a piano for the first time. She thought about Esperanza Ruiz and her exacting standards and her genuine belief in what Maria could become. She thought about all the years the music had spent waiting inside her while she built the life that needed building. Then she placed her hands on the keys and began to play, and the sound filled the small room completely. And it was like coming home to a place you had never stopped loving, even when you had told yourself on the harder days that you had.